When we talk about smuggling and selling marijuana in the United States at the end of the 20th century, the Colombian and Mexican cartels that supplied goods from their countries to the United States most likely come to mind. However, few people know that at the same time, there was an organization within the United States that produced no less, and perhaps even more marijuana than the Colombians and Mexicans imported. Right under the authorities' noses, they harvested hundreds of tons of the drug, from fields spread across almost the entire southeast of the country. They had their own strain of marijuana, their own code of silence, and later, as is customary, their own name, coined by journalists. Meet the Cornbread Mafia on the other side of the law. Our story begins in Kentucky, a state founded by persecuted Catholics from Maryland in the 18th century. 200 years later, especially in Marion County, a distilling industry developed that practically became the basis of the economy. Hundreds of Catholic families in the country made their living solely from working in distilleries. This became especially noticeable when Prohibition came, followed by the Great Depression. The new rules left the Catholic and Protestant minorities of Marion without work. No one offered any decent alternatives, so people started looking for them themselves. The county's residents decided that the only law that could dictate their rules was God's law. And since there was no prohibition on the sale of alcohol in the Holy Scriptures, the instructions of Congress could be disregarded. And so, bootlegging flourished in Marion, with all its consequences: wars with inspectors, shootouts between the police and gangsters trying to free bourbon from distillery warehouses, and the discovery of huge moonshine stills that surpassed the size of legal distilleries from the pre-Prohibition era. Gradually, Marion County became a well-known center for illegal alcohol production, attracting both criminals and law enforcement agencies. During Prohibition, moonshiners flourished throughout the United States, especially between the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, but Kentucky had advantages: proximity to northern cities such as Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland, and knowledge of the commercial distillation process. While most moonshiners used inefficient stills that produced about 190 liters per day, Marion County used steam stills that produced up to 1,100 liters per day. According to local lore, Al Capone himself visited local moonshine distilleries during his trips to Louisville to establish cooperation. And when Capone passed through Marion County in May 1932 on his way to federal prison in Atlanta, local moonshiners lined the railroad tracks to say goodbye to the man who had helped them earn a living. As the train sped past them, they raised their jugs of whiskey in salute. Incidentally, a year later, another celebrity of the criminal world visited Marion County: John Dillinger, recently released from prison. In the summer of 1933, Dillinger used the county as a base for bank robberies in Indiana and Ohio, and on August 11, 1933, on his way from Kentucky, Dillinger robbed a bank in Gravel Switch in the eastern part of the county with the help of local residents. Marion County became an attractive refuge for criminals because the locals kept their mouths shut. After numerous raids on farms, they realized that concealing the truth was their only protection from Prohibition inspectors, which led to an unspoken code of silence passed down from generation to generation. After Prohibition was repealed in 1933, Marion County did not stop producing illegal alcohol, even during World War II when the government rationed sugar, a key ingredient in moonshine. During World War II, farmers in various parts of America, at the request of the federal government, grew hemp for military purposes, even though hemp and marijuana for consumption had been banned since 1937. The fact is that the U.S. Navy needed ropes made from hemp fibers, and its main supplier, the Philippines, was lost in 1941. Of the 9 states that grew hemp, only Kentucky supplied seeds, which were then planted in tropical regions with longer growing seasons, such as Brazil and Hawaii. In 1942, Marion County was supposed to produce seeds for 200,000 hectares of hemp. Although they had never seen this crop grown before, young men from Marion County who had not been drafted into the war worked in the fields, tending acres of hemp. After harvesting in the fall, they ran the hemp stalks through a threshing machine that separated the seeds from the husks. And since the government only wanted the seeds, the farmers burned everything else. The farmers quickly realized that burning this crop made them feel strange, and this was the first step toward the local residents producing marijuana on a massive scale. However, the manifestation of this effect may raise some doubts, as knowledgeable people claim that industrial hemp does not contain enough tetrahydrocannabinol, THC for short, to achieve a narcotic effect. Here, we can only take the word of people who worked there, and shared their memories. To understand the context of the events we will discuss further, it's important to keep in mind that first, since the days of bootlegging, the residents of Marion County have been accustomed to placing family ties and mutual assistance above the law. And second, they already had experience in growing marijuana, but the variety they produced was of too low quality to be consumed as a drug. The problem of Kentucky marijuana will be solved by the central character of our story, so meet Johnny Boon. Johnny Boon spent his childhood on a farm located on Bloomfield Road, Washington, which belonged to his mother's family. His father, Daniel Boon, was a domestic tyrant and alcoholic. A good day for Johnny and his brothers and sisters was when their father fell asleep before they returned from school. Otherwise, Daniel Boon's children had to hide under their beds or jump out of windows to avoid their father's belt. Their mother also had a hard time. Johnny always remembered the time when his father beat her with a fishing rod, and little Johnny took his mother to the doctor to have a fishhook removed from her cheek. In search of a father figure, Johnny Boon turned to his maternal grandfather, Poss Walker, the owner of extensive family farmland. Poss Walker, hardened by the Prohibition era, learned to supplement the family budget by moonshining, smuggling, and other means he deemed necessary to keep the farm afloat. He included these activities in his mentorship of his grandson, teaching young Boon skills for which no awards were given. In addition to moonshining, Walker taught Boon to grow tobacco in excess of the established quota, which incidentally was also suppressed by the government. Walker helped his 11-year-old grandson grow 0.7 acres of tobacco, for which he took 7th place in the county youth tobacco growing competition. In 1958, at the age of 15, Johnny Boon won the 4-H state championship in sheep farming, receiving a trip to Chicago for the National 4-H Congress as a prize. In 1960, Boon once again conquered Kentucky with his tobacco, making him a 2-time state champion. His winning tobacco project covered 2.6 acres, where he personally irrigated the land and carefully harvested the shoots and all the leaves. Johnny Boon graduated from high school in 1961 as a talented football player and 6th in his class academically. The local newspaper predicted he would attend the University of Kentucky, but fate had other plans. Despite his intelligence and ambition, Johnny Boon started a family and remained on the farm to continue his grandfather's traditions. After getting married and giving up on college, Johnny Boon began farming and making moonshine to support his family. Although his home and property were in Washington County, Boon was drawn to Marion County, where some people considered compliance with certain laws optional. Starting in the 1960s, Marion County began to quietly experiment with growing marijuana for sale. The impetus for this was the return of Vietnam War veterans to the county. Johnny Boon himself never fought in the Vietnam War, but he learned about the events of those years from veteran Bobby Joe Schumacher. He talked about the brutality and lack of rules on the battlefield, which inevitably left their mark on the moral values and mindset of people like Bob. This experience prepared Schumacher and other veterans for life in a world without rules, where honesty led to poverty and lawlessness led to wealth. Returning Vietnam veterans helped criminal elements in Marion County establish connections with a nationwide network of veterans. This underground network contributed to Marion County's boom in the cultivation and sale of marijuana, which was delivered to customers across the country. Experienced farmers used their expertise in growing tobacco and participating in agricultural programs to grow marijuana, and at some point, Boon, influenced by his surroundings, became one of them. He started growing marijuana, but simply growing it wasn't enough, because, as we remember, the local marijuana didn't contain enough THC to compete in the rapidly growing market. It was necessary to create a new strain, one that would be suitable for consumption and adapt to the Kentucky climate. For Boon, this was a real challenge, and he accepted it. Boon began experimenting with cannabis genetics, but he did not do it alone. His partner was a man who traveled the world collecting high-quality marijuana strains. We still don't know who this mysterious assistant was, nor do we know his origin or age. In sources about the Cornbread Mafia, he's often referred to simply as Mr. X. So Boon's experiment began. He had 2 tasks ahead of him. First, to adapt the seeds to the conditions in Kentucky, and second, to increase the THC content in the marijuana. Mr. X supplied Boon with marijuana seeds from different parts of the world. At first, these were Mexican and Colombian varieties, then seeds from India, Pakistan, the Middle East, Kabul, and Afghanistan. Over time, he even got hold of a supposedly Russian variety of marijuana somewhere. With Mr. X's support, Boon crossed different varieties with the variety most often referred to as indica, trying to obtain a variety that could grow fully in Kentucky and would not be inferior to imported goods. As a result, indica and sativa were used as the basis for the new variety, but it's not known what else was added during the selection process. In the end, Johnny Boon achieved what he had been striving for. After about 7 years of experimentation, he developed his own flawless strain of marijuana called Kentucky Bluegrass, which quickly spread among local farmers. After the farmer grew and harvested the marijuana, the product had to undergo processing, known as manicuring. Johnny Boon himself described this lengthy and tedious task as follows. You have to pull a couple of 100 pounds of weed out of the field, and you have to sit on buckets and chairs to pull all the sticks and debris out of it. You have to sit, and sit, damn it. Sitting, and sitting was much more effective in a large group. The work of manicuring marijuana, which involved prolonged sitting and trimming the buds by hand, was performed only by trusted people who knew how to keep quiet. This monotonous work forced people who would not normally spend much time together to tolerate each other longer than many thought possible. And as we know, the more time you spend with someone, the more you begin to trust them. It was probably something like this. While trimming buds from the stems, sitting in a barn, a group of men became the team that would form the backbone of the future Cornbread Mafia. Among the participants in these gatherings were the sons of former bootlegger Squire Bickett, Joe and Jimmy, who had been involved in various criminal adventures since childhood. Bobby Joe Schumacher and Garland Russell also joined the team. Garland Russell was not a local, and little is known about his life before he arrived in Marion. He was an experienced criminal who had already been to prison. Garland Russell was a very tough guy. He was accepted into the Cornbread Mafia, which at that time did not have a name at all, purely on the principle that since this psychopath is here, he'd better be with us than against us. However, although Russell's reputation helped in business, his rage and propensity for violence often caused problems. For example, once, when the young people of the Cornbread Mafia discovered that someone was stealing plants from their plot near the Rolling Fork River, Russell gathered the team and they, armed with shotguns, crossed the river to punish the family they suspected of stealing marijuana. They opened fire on the house, smashed the windows, damaged a car, and killed a dog. Not satisfied with this, Russell broke down the door and wanted to kill everyone, including children and the elderly, but his own people stopped him. In the late 1970s, Russell got involved in another shootout and disappeared, after which neither the police nor his relatives were able to find him, but his daughters, who were hoping to inherit his fortune, were unable to prove his death. No one knows what happened to Garland Russell, and if anyone does know, they are keeping quiet. Incidentally, there's a theory that he was the first to coin the term Cornbread Mafia. Although this name was not meant to be taken seriously, it would be like a group of boys who steal candy from a kiosk for fun, calling themselves mafiosi. But why is it called the Cornbread Mafia? Because one of the most popular methods of disguising marijuana was to plant it among cornfields. Apart from characters such as Garland Russell, the so-called Cornbread Mafia mainly consisted of ordinary farmers and former bootleggers who were simply doing business in conditions of terrible unemployment. On Christmas Eve 1980, Lebanon Enterprise reporter Ninny Glasscock surveyed a group of at least 40 people gathered at the county courthouse to file for unemployment benefits, and the information she gathered was grim. Here's one man's story. I have 4 small children. I haven't worked since July. I've looked everywhere for work, but no one is hiring, and the bills have to be paid. It's hard not to be able to make my children happy at Christmas. A mother of 7 who had lost her job a week before the holiday admitted that they would not have a Christmas tree this year, but added, "We are luckier than some. Many have nothing at all." In short, for many, growing or transporting marijuana was their last chance to feed their families, and people were willing to do it. They became part of a community that would later be portrayed as a hierarchical and dangerous organization, but was in fact a simple association of men producing and exporting a product, no division into bosses, capos, and consiglieri, no rituals, and no clear distribution of tasks. To make it clearer, imagine that several houses in a village decided to grow potatoes for a restaurant chain and, dividing themselves into teams, planted huge fields. Those who know how to dig and loosen the soil do so. Those who have a truck and connections deliver the final product. And those who know how to both dig and drive do both in turn. Only in our case, it was necessary to keep quiet about the potato fields, and it was better to transport them along back roads, the ones that bootleggers used to choose a few years ago. The idea of the Cornbread Mafia as a tough organization was developed by the press, which was generously fed by the Drug Enforcement Administration. Well, and also Johnny Boon, one of the most famous members of this organization, really did look like a serious mafia boss. In the public's opinion, he definitely fit the supposed physical description of a man who headed a criminal organization that had absolute control over its subordinates. However, his friend Joe Bickett noted that he was more like Santa Claus. According to Bickett, Boon was honest in his dealings, and if you were his friend, I can assure you that he had your back. If the farmers from Marion and the mafiosi we are familiar with had anything in common, it was omerta, staying silent. Although the farmers didn't know that what they were observing was omerta, but that's beside the point. The Italian mafia demanded that its members under no circumstances cooperate with the law or reveal the secrets of the organization. The guys from Cornbread Mafia also observed this code of silence, so diligently that even the Sicilian mafia would have been jealous. You'll see this for yourself when we talk about the last years of the organization. For now, let's just note that the Cornbread Mafia was largely based on mutual assistance. As one particular recalled, one group might have a harvest in Tennessee while another might have a harvest in West Virginia, and a third might have a harvest in Indiana. Members of the Cornbread Mafia agreed that one group would give a certain percentage of its harvest for a certain percentage of another's. Thus, if one harvest failed in Tennessee, the group still had a percentage of the harvest from another state to fall back on. It was a kind of insurance policy that prevented the complete loss of the harvest. Since Boon's genetic experiments began to yield good results, the status of Kentucky marijuana on the market began to gradually rise from only good for livestock to damn, it's no worse than California's, and it's half the price. The only drawback as a commodity was the prejudice of buyers, who were accustomed to considering Marion's product unsuitable hay. To combat this, Marion County producers changed the appearance of their product and sold it under different names. They used various methods to imitate the characteristics of Jamaican and Colombian weed. However, as Kentucky producers improved their skills and information about the quality of the Bluegrass variety spread, they stopped disguising their product. Kentucky marijuana began to sell itself. Some distributors processed a ton of Kentucky marijuana per week. Large buyers pre-ordered the harvest, financing the seeds, fertilizers, and cultivation. In short, business was booming. Of course, it's difficult to remain undetected for long when the result of your activities occupies huge fields scattered across different parts of the county. The police first suspected that secret grass was being grown in Marion County on July 10, 1973, when a police officer in Lebanon, Kentucky, stopped a car in which they found 60 brown paper bags of a product with a distinctive smell. The officer estimated that each bag contained enough marijuana to make 100 joints, valued at $1 each, resulting in a total seizure of $6,000. In 1976, the police first became acquainted with Johnny Boon's cannabis business. It happened like this. One day, Johnny Boon discovered that a thief had visited his farm in Washington County and stole a whole new row of marijuana from his field. Boon decided to ambush the thief and spent the whole night watching the property with his most trusted partner, his 10-year-old son Jeffrey. Meanwhile, a few miles away, a state trooper pulled over a car for speeding, and the driver turned out to be the same man who had stolen from Boon's plantation. The driver was no fool and bargained his way out of the speeding ticket in exchange for the location of the best marijuana plantation he had ever seen. So the patrolman drove to Johnny Boon's farm and pulled up right at his cattle gate, 100 feet from where Boon was hiding in the dark with his rifle and his son. At first, Boon thought he had found his thief, but fortunately for everyone, the patrolmen identified themselves before Johnny used his rifle. This wasn't Boon's first run-in with the law. In the late 1960s, Boon had already been arrested, along with a Marion County farmer when they were caught making whiskey, which wasn't exactly legal since they didn't pay taxes on the business. However, this time Boon's activities were much more impressive. So, in the fall of 1976, when the police approached his valuable plot of land with grass, Johnny Boon didn't panic or try denying anything. He simply surrendered, and the state police stumbled upon one of the first farms where the increasingly popular Kentucky bluegrass was grown. This time, Boon somehow managed to avoid arrest, but it was not a final victory. In the 1970s, the Cornbread Mafia managed to A. form an alliance of farmers, B. bring a competitive product to market, and C. attract the attention of the police. Some of the guys already ended up behind bars. The 1980s were no less eventful. For starters, the game of cat and mouse with the police, federal agents, and the Drug Enforcement Administration continued. But despite the fact that the ranks of the Cornbread Mafia were noticeably thinning, weed production in Kentucky continued. In response to the specific threat to law and order emanating from Marion County, the Kentucky State Police was one of the first in the country to use helicopters to detect illegal crops. In 1980, in just 1 week, the Kentucky State Police, with the support of a helicopter from Jefferson County, discovered and destroyed more than 45 acres of marijuana in Marion County, and another 20 acres in neighboring Washington County. Sometimes no special technology was needed to catch offenders, just the connections that held the entire Cornbread Mafia together. For example, in 1983, 5 farms were discovered at once in the Hart County area. It all started when a man from Raywick County named Chip introduced a group of men from Marion County to some people from Hart County. His team included Governor Louis Nunn's nephew, Donnie Nunn, who showed his friends some of the places where marijuana was grown. These friends turned out to be law enforcement officers who unfriendly arrested the farmers who had planted more than 22,000 plants in 5 fields. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Bowling Green tried to get several of the arrested men to turn in the rest of the team, but without success. No one wanted to talk. They even offered immunity to one of the men and called him before a grand jury, but he still refused to turn in the others. However, not all Kentucky farmers saw their fortunes decline, at least not immediately. In 1980, at a time when many members of the Cornbread Mafia were desperately evading federal raids, Bobby Joe Schumacher was looking for opportunities to expand. Somehow, law enforcement was able to detect the large crops he was overseeing. Instead of selling weed on the local market, he established connections in South Florida, where he shipped his entire harvest. Buyers in Florida mixed Kentucky marijuana with imported weed and shipped it across the country. Although the 1980 raids slowed local weed production in Kentucky, demand remained. Bobby Joe and his partners seized the opportunity and also organized shipments of weed from Central and South America through their connections in Florida. Around the same time, there was a mass immigration of Cubans to the United States through the port of Mariel. Cuban President Fidel Castro allowed anyone who wanted to immigrate to do so after thousands of Cubans tried to seek refuge in the Peruvian embassy. The arrival of the refugees created a problem for President Jimmy Carter, especially after it became known that there were convicted criminals among them. Shipping from Mariel was suspended in October 1980, but more than 100,000 Cubans had already arrived in Florida, placing a huge burden on the U.S. Coast Guard. Bobby Joe and other smugglers seized the opportunity to transport marijuana into the U.S., knowing that the Coast Guard was busy with Cuban refugees. He established connections with smugglers who delivered boats with Colombian marijuana to the Key West area. To transport the marijuana to the mainland, Bobby Joe devised a cunning plan. In Kentucky, he purchased used pickup trucks equipped with toolboxes and construction equipment. In order to pass off the marijuana transporters as ordinary fuel trucks, their trucks were deliberately dirtied and splattered with diesel fuel, oil, and grease, and dummy fuel tanks were bolted to the body of each truck to conceal wooden boxes of marijuana. The drivers wore dirty work clothes. Under this clever guise, the trucks loaded with marijuana left their hiding places and headed for Kentucky. The Coast Guard, focused on Cuban refugees, let the dirty construction trucks pass through checkpoints without asking any questions. Bobby Joe soon realized that he could make more money from smuggling than from growing marijuana. He then strengthened his ties with smugglers in Florida who supplied him with as much weed as he could distribute. Bobby Joe and his new partner, whose name we do not know, purchased 2 vessels for transporting cigarettes and established ties with smugglers who delivered marijuana to the Gulf of Mexico. There, the 2 boats transported 4,000 pounds of marijuana each to Everglades City, from where semi-trailers carried the huge loads north to Atlanta and Kentucky. During this operation, Bobby Joe and his team brought about 50,000 pounds of weed to the United States. In St. Augustine, Florida, Bobby Joe organized another smuggling operation, using shrimp boats to deliver marijuana from a floating base ship. However, he was less fortunate here. In 1985, 30 witnesses from Florida and Georgia turned him and his accomplices in to federal agents, saying that Bobby Joe Schumacher had taken over 1,000 pounds of marijuana from the ship and transported it by truck to Kentucky. When he was found guilty, Schumacher paid his $250,000 bail and went on the run. Even while in hiding, Schumacher continued to run a network of marijuana farms in several states until May 1989, when police arrested him in a resort town in Canada. But let's go back a little. On October 23, 1987, the small world of the Cornbread Mafia was shaken by an event that significantly dampened its fighting spirit. On that day, Minnesota law enforcement officers obtained a search warrant for a farm located in Otter Tail County. A sophisticated system for growing, processing, and packaging marijuana was discovered on the farm. The weed was growing in a cornfield, and the buildings and grain silos were filled to capacity. The barn housed a processing center, including equipment for drying, cutting, sorting, and packaging marijuana. Packaged bags of marijuana were found, with the total volume of weed estimated at no less than 45 tons. The second floor of the barn housed a work area with radios, cigarettes, and drinks. Sleeping bags and cots were also found in the barn. The house was something of a dormitory for the workers. As a result of this raid, 62 dump trucks were taken away with marijuana and 17 Kentucky residents were arrested, including Johnny Boon, whom we already know. While Johnny Boon and his workers sat in their cramped cells in Minnesota, federal investigators began to understand the scale of the Cornbread Mafia's operations. Although the seizure of 45 tons in Minnesota was the largest in the state's history, it turned out that it was not the only one. Investigators began to see connections to a network of farms in different states. In 1987, the Drug Enforcement Administration was confident that the vast majority of marijuana sold in America was smuggled in from across the southern border, but Johnny Boon's farm opened the agents' eyes to a threat they had overlooked: a huge marijuana growing empire right under their noses. Investigators bombarded Kentucky residents, who couldn't have been unaware of the Cornbread Mafia, with questions but got nowhere. Although the Kentuckians were polite and friendly to the agents, they all remained silent. In the end, after all the arrests had been made, the 17 arrested in Minnesota and Wisconsin joined the 53 others, and none of them agreed to talk to investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, a fact that impressed even the prosecutors. So much for the emerto we talked about earlier. Boon hired a lawyer from Louisville to perform his assigned task almost flawlessly. After a brief stay in local jails and correctional facilities, the entire Minnesota crew was released on bail, all except Johnny Boon, because in his case, it was not only illegal marijuana cultivation, but also a violation of his parole. The fact is that this was not Johnny Boon's first prison term. In March 1982, he had already received 5 years when law enforcement discovered his large-scale farm in Belize. However, he was released early in the fall of 1984. One of the rules of his parole in 1984 was that he was not allowed to leave Kentucky, but Boon violated this rule 3 years later. He had big plans to grow marijuana in Minnesota. Boon did not want to plead guilty, but his lawyer convinced him that otherwise he could face life imprisonment. In the end, Boon agreed, and he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Here, some clarification is needed. During the period described, U.S. policy toward drug traffickers underwent some changes. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, a powerful addition to his 1984 package. The law was the federal government's way of saying no, as Reagan put it, adding $1.7 billion in taxpayer money to the $2.2 billion already spent each year on the war on drugs to improve law enforcement programs, toughen penalties for people who break drug laws, and increase the federal government's payroll to maintain several thousand drug enforcement agents. These changes set off a time bomb. On November 1, 1987, all drug offenders received sentences of 10 years or more. The only relief for Johnny Boon after his arrest was that it happened in the last week of October rather than the first week of November. Because he was arrested before November 1st, the effective date of the mandatory provisions of the 1988 Crime Control Act, Johnny Boon only had to serve 66% of his sentence. On April 29, 1988, Boon faced his sentencing, which began at 10:30 a.m. Finally, when the judge asked if Boon had anything to say, he delivered a monologue that could have been a key scene in a movie about the Cornbread Mafia, if such a movie had been made. The gist of it was that he and his colleagues had chosen their paths simply to make money in the face of unemployment. I'm not making excuses, I'm just saying that because of the situation in our neighborhood, marijuana is one of the things that sometimes helps people make a living. We're not criminals, Your Honor. We are not the kind of people who go out and hurt others. We even try to feed families that aren't ours. Some even feed small children who have no breadwinners at home. that's what we do. And I personally am very sorry about what happened. It's caused a lot of problems for families and a lot of grief, and I hope the court will treat this group of people with mercy. We didn't want to hurt anyone." After listening to him, the judge said, "Thank you," and the hearing came to an end. Although Johnny Boon was not the boss, and the entire economy of the Cornbread Mafia did not depend on him, his arrest was still a significant event. A psychological factor played a role here. The members of the Cornbread Mafia, who were still at large, thought that since Johnny Boon, one of the founders of the organization, the inventor of Kentucky Bluegrass, and just a cool guy, had been arrested, it didn't look good for them either. Did the farmers give up their marijuana business? No. They still had families to feed, and they still hoped that they would be luckier than Boon. As Joe Bickett said, "If you keep rolling dice, sooner or later you're gonna get knocked out of the game. We all knew the odds, but we kept playing." It was getting harder and harder to play. First, the FBI and police had turned their attention to the Marion County farmers and were conducting a targeted crackdown using helicopters to scan fields from the air. Second, cocaine was flooding the market, which was not conducive to business. Cocaine competed with marijuana, and demand for weed declined. But that was only one side of the coin. Even worse for the farmers was that the members of the Cornbread Mafia did not deny themselves cocaine, which made them less capable and focused workers. In 1985, cocaine even caused a fundamental split in the once friendly Cornbread Mafia. At one point, two leading forces emerged in the Corn Mafia: Johnny Boon and Schumacher. Schumacher and his people were based in Kansas, while Boon led his crews in Minnesota. Before the network was broken up and they were all caught, the Kansas and Minnesota branches were almost in a state of Cold War. The Kansas guys' cocaine use led to a major rift between them and Johnny Boon, who wanted them to stop doing that shit. The final blow to the Cornbread Mafia came at a 1989 conference in Louisville, after which the media began to portray the farmers' organization as a real mafia, which increased the number of raids and funding for those raids. The Cornbread Mafia was slowly falling apart. Johnny Boon ended up in the United States Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana, a prison with a reputation as the worst in the federal correctional system, where the government sent prisoners it would rather see dead. Terre Haute was unofficially a death sentence for most of those who arrived there, either dying of natural causes before the end of their long sentences or being killed by the violent prison population. Johnny Boon was not a gangster, but he was a tough guy with a menacing appearance who knew how to command respect, which is why he managed to settle in there. He made friends, including some guys from the Cosa Nostra, and after talking with them, Boon learned that all these years the members of his Cornbread Mafia had been observing a code of silence called omerta. As they say, better late than never. Impressed by this discovery, Johnny Boon even asked a tattoo artist to tattoo the word omerta on his back. In April 1993, Boon was transferred to a facility in Manchester, Kentucky, where he was met by the Bickett brothers and a whole group of men from Kentucky who were incarcerated for the same reason as him. It was like a reunion of friends. Then, in the late 1990s, when Johnny Boon was nearing his release, the Bureau of Prisons transferred him to a facility in Lexington, Kentucky, just 60 miles from home. Shortly after, Jimmy Bickett was also transferred there, so he wasn't lonely. Johnny was finally released sometime in 1999. However, in 2008, he was again charged with growing marijuana. At that point, Johnny disappeared and his whereabouts remained unknown until his capture in Montreal, Canada, in December 2016. He was sentenced to 57 months in the Elkton Federal Correctional Institution in Ohio, but was released in June 2020 due to the COVID outbreak. Boon died in Lebanon, Kentucky on June 14, 2024. He was 80 years old. The Cornbread Mafia gradually disappeared completely. Some were arrested, others eventually gave up this risky business. However, this did not help to spread the secrets of the ambiguous organization. The omerta of the Kentuckians continued to live on even after the arrest of key leaders. And do you know what's most interesting about this story? Since 1996, various states have gradually begun to legalize marijuana for medical purposes. In Kentucky, this happened in 2013. And since 2012, following Colorado and Washington, some states have also allowed cultivation for recreational purposes. I can just picture Johnny Boon high in the clouds, contemplating the fields of cannabis that have suddenly become legal.